Washington, D.C., 1940. The air in the small room at Howard University is thick with the scent of old paper and the quiet hum of a city that legislates division. This isn't a grand laboratory. It's a makeshift space, borrowed and pieced together with fierce determination. Inside, a 4-year-old black child sits on a small wooden chair. Before her, on a low table, are 2 dolls. They are identical in every way. The same cherubic face, the same simple dress, the same outstretched arms. But they differ in one inescapable detail. One is starkly white. The other is a deep, unambiguous brown. Dr. Mamie Clark, a graduate student whose mind is as sharp as the injustice she seeks to dismantle, leans forward. Her voice is gentle, a deliberate calm in the face of a question designed to fracture silence. "Show me the doll that you like to play with," she asks. The child's small hand hesitates for a fraction of a second before moving decisively toward the white doll. Mamie makes a note, her pen scratching against the paper, a sound that seems impossibly loud. She continues, "Show me the doll that is the nice doll." Again, the white doll is chosen. The questions pivot. Now show me the doll that looks bad. This time, the child's finger drifts, almost reluctantly, to point at the brown doll. The final question hangs in the air, heavy and heartbreaking. "Give me the doll that looks like you." The child looks down at her own hands, then back at the dolls. A flicker of confusion, of pain, crosses her face before she pushes the brown doll forward. This was not a game. This was the raw, unfiltered data of a soul being warped in real time. This was the genesis of the doll test, an experiment born from Mamie Clark's master's thesis, a project she developed with her husband and intellectual partner, Dr. Kenneth Clark. Together, they were building a new kind of weapon, not of steel, but of science, to wage war on a lie. The lie was separate but equal, the doctrine enshrined by the 1896 Supreme Court case which gave legal cover to the brutal architecture of Jim Crow segregation. Proponents of segregation argued it was a benign social arrangement, that it inflicted no real harm. The Clarks suspected this was a profound, calculated falsehood. They hypothesized that segregation was a form of psychological violence, a systemic poison that taught black children to hate the very skin they were in. But in a world that measured injury in broken bones and legal statutes, how could you prove a wound you couldn't see? How could you show a court the scar on a child's identity? The Clarks' methodology was deceptively simple, a design of elegant and devastating clarity. They presented children aged 3 to 7 with the 2 dolls and a series of 8 questions. These questions probed 4 distinct areas: racial preference, racial identification, awareness of racial differences, and self-awareness. The results they gathered from that initial group of 150 black children in segregated D.C. nursery schools were a quiet cataclysm. A 4-year-old child and so many others like her were not outliers. They were the norm. A staggering 67% preferred to play with the white doll. A full 59% stated the white doll was the nice one, while an equal number identified the brown doll as looking bad. The most wrenching moments, as Kenneth Clark would later recount in his notes, came when the children were forced to confront their own identity. Some would become emotionally upset at having to identify with the doll they had just rejected. They would burst into tears or run out of the room, unable to reconcile the bad doll with their own reflection. One child, when asked to identify the doll that was like him, smiled and pointed to the white doll, insisting, "That's a nigger. I'm a nigger," yet still refusing to associate himself with the brown doll. The Clarks were not just observing a preference. They were documenting the genesis of self-hatred. They were witnessing the precise moment a child learns that the world has assigned them a place of lesser value. This wasn't sociology in the abstract. This was the intimate, granular evidence of a system succeeding at its most sinister goal: colonization of the mind. Their work was a direct refutation of the era's prevailing psychological theories, which often pathologized Black communities without ever indicting the white supremacist structures that constrained them. The Clarks were flipping the script, putting the system itself on trial. Their findings would shock a nation, but could a child's heartbreaking choice, documented on a clipboard in a small university room, truly break the law? Following that unsettling observation, the Clarks understood that a small study in Washington, D.C., however profound, could be dismissed as an anomaly. To challenge a century of legal precedent, they needed a mountain of evidence, a data set so robust and geographically diverse that it would be impossible to ignore. They expanded their study, transforming Mamie's thesis into a nationwide investigation. Over the next decade, they conducted hundreds of doll tests, meticulously documenting the responses of Black children in both the segregated schools of the South and the more subtly segregated schools of the North. They traveled to Clarendon County, South Carolina, a place of stark, rural poverty where Black children walked miles to dilapidated one-room schoolhouses while white children rode buses to pristine, well-funded facilities. They tested children in Delaware and in Virginia. With each new location, the pattern held, a grim and consistent testament to the pervasive nature of American racism. The results were not just anecdotal, they were a statistically significant indictment. Their meticulous data became the foundation for a series of seminal academic papers published in outlets like and The. In their 1947 paper, Racial Identification and Preference in Negro Children, they laid out the stark numbers for the world to see. They demonstrated that by the age of 5, Black children had already absorbed the prevailing social prejudices, often identifying whiteness with intelligence, beauty, and goodness, while associating Blackness with ugliness and inferiority. This wasn't a matter of simple preference, like choosing a favorite color. The Clarks framed it as something far more damaging, a fundamental distortion of the personality. They argued that the state, by enforcing segregation, was actively inflicting psychological harm and creating a mark of inferiority that could last a lifetime. This was a revolutionary concept. It moved the argument against segregation from the realm of morality and fairness into the language of science and measurable injury. Yet despite this overwhelming psychological evidence, the resistance was formidable. The academic world of the 1940s and 50s was a fortress of white male authority. The Clarks' work, emerging from a historically Black university and authored by a Black couple, was easily marginalized. Some colleagues in the field of psychology dismissed their findings as sociological rather than scientific, a common coded criticism used to devalue research that focused on social justice. They faced questions about their methodology, with critics suggesting the children's choices were not necessarily evidence of self-hatred, but perhaps a reflection of the toys available to them. Segregationist politicians and thinkers were even more hostile. They attacked the very idea of psychological harm as a flimsy, unprovable concept. John W. Davis, the lead lawyer who would argue in favor of segregation before the Supreme Court, would later mock this new brand of evidence as an attempt to substitute the rule of law with the hazy and cloudy field of psychology. The system was designed to reject this kind of truth. The law recognized physical harm, property damage, and contractual breaches. It had no framework for a wounded spirit, a fractured sense of self. The institutional gatekeepers, from journal editors to court officials, were predisposed to see the Clarks' data not as objective fact, but as a political agenda wrapped in scientific jargon. The question became, how could science possibly challenge decades of legal precedent upholding separate but equal when the very definition of evidence was controlled by the system they were trying to change? The law recognized physical harm, property damage, and contractual breaches. It had no framework for a wounded spirit, a fractured sense of self. The institutional gatekeepers, from journal editors to court officials, were predisposed to see the Clarks' data not as objective fact, but as a political agenda wrapped in scientific jargon. The question became, how could science possibly challenge decades of legal precedent upholding separate but equal when the very definition of evidence was controlled by the system they were trying to change? Building on those devastating findings, the Clarks' work found its champion in a man who understood that the battle for civil rights had to be fought on all fronts, in the streets, in the legislature, and in the courtroom. Thurgood Marshall, the brilliant and tireless lead counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, was assembling a series of cases aimed at dismantling school segregation. His strategy was audacious. He wouldn't just argue that segregated facilities were unequal in resources, a fact that was often demonstrably true but could theoretically be remedied. He would argue that the very act of separation was inherently unequal because it inflicted a deep and lasting psychological wound. To prove it, he needed more than legal arguments. He needed the Clark science. In 1951, as the NAACP prepared for the case of dolls in South Carolina, they hired Kenneth Clark to replicate his doll study with the children of Clarendon County. The results were the same. The science was solid. The harm was real. This research, along with other social science data, was compiled into a groundbreaking report titled The Effects of Segregation and the Consequences of Desegregation, a social science statement. It was signed by 32 of the nation's most prominent social scientists and would become a critical appendix to the NAACP's legal brief. When the case, along with 4 others, was bundled into the landmark case known as Plessy versus Ferguson, the doll test was ready for its ultimate stage. In the hallowed marble halls of the U.S. Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall, lead counsel for the NAACP, did something revolutionary. He put the psychological state of black children at the very center of a constitutional argument. He described the Clarks' findings, painting a vivid picture of children rejecting dolls that looked just like them. He argued that state-sponsored segregation retards the educational and mental development of Negro children and deprives them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. He was translating the Clarks' data into the language of the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection of the laws. On May 17, 1954, the court delivered its unanimous decision. Chief Justice Earl Warren, writing for the court, penned the words that would change a nation. He stated, "To separate them from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone." This was the language of the Clarks. The connection was made explicit in the decision's most famous and, at the time, most controversial element, footnote 11. There, for the first time in its history, the Supreme Court cited psychological and sociological studies as a basis for its ruling, with Kenneth Clark's work listed prominently. The wall between social science and constitutional law had been breached. The hazy and cloudy field of psychology that John W. Davis had mocked had become the bedrock of a legal revolution. The court had officially acknowledged that systemic prejudice inflicted quantifiable psychological damage. The child's game didn't just break the law. It exposed the human cost of injustice, reminding us that true progress often demands confronting uncomfortable truths, even when they emerge from the mouths of babes.